The streets of Cedar Grove were quiet that October evening, with only the occasional car passing through its well-maintained suburban lanes. The neighborhood had always been peaceful, the kind of place where people left their garage doors open during the day and kids played basketball in their driveways until sunset. But lately, things had been different. Ever since Officer Reynolds and his partner had taken over the evening patrol, residents had started noticing a change in the atmosphere. That night, the autumn air carried a slight chill, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement. Officer Reynolds sat in his patrol car, drumming his fingers on the steering wheel as he watched the traffic pass by. He wasn't looking for anything specific, or at least that's what he would say if anyone asked. But the residents knew better. They'd seen how he operated, how he seemed to take a special interest in certain vehicles, certain people. Around 8:30 p.m., a dark blue pickup truck caught his attention. It was clean, well-maintained, nothing flashy. Just a regular Ford F-150 with out-of-state plates. The driver appeared to be following all traffic rules, maintaining perfect speed, using turn signals properly. In fact, the truck's careful adherence to every traffic regulation seemed to irritate Reynolds even more. "Let's see what we've got here," Reynolds muttered to his partner, adjusting his rearview mirror to get a better look at the vehicle. The truck's driver sat with perfect posture, hands positioned exactly at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. Something about the driver's military-precise positioning made Reynolds suspicious. Or perhaps that's just what he told himself to justify what he was about to do. Through his window, Reynolds could see families settling in for the night. Living room lights glowed warmly behind curtains, and the smell of someone's barbecue lingered in the air. A couple walking their dog paused to watch as the patrol car pulled out onto the street, following the blue pickup. The husband shook his head slightly. They'd seen this scene play out before. The pickup's driver, a man in his mid-30s, noticed the patrol car in his mirrors but remained calm. He'd done nothing wrong, and his steady hands on the wheel showed no sign of nervousness. He continued driving exactly at the speed limit, making his way through the residential streets as if he didn't have a police car tailing him. For 3 blocks, Reynolds followed the truck, waiting for any small mistake. A rolling stop, a turn signal used too late, anything that would give him an excuse. But the driver gave him nothing. Each stop was perfect, each turn precisely signaled, every traffic rule followed to the letter. This seemed to frustrate Reynolds even more. Inside the patrol car, Reynolds ran the out-of-state plates, but everything came back clean. The registration was current, no outstanding tickets, nothing that would justify a stop. Still, something about this driver bothered him. Maybe it was the military bearing, or perhaps it was just another one of Reynolds' hunches that the local community had come to dread. The blue pickup turned onto Maple Street, heading toward the town center. The driver maintained his composed demeanor, but in his rearview mirror, he could see Reynolds' patrol car edging closer. Other residents on their porches or walking their dogs watched the scene unfold, their expressions a mix of concern and resignation. They'd witnessed similar situations before, and they knew what was likely coming next. As the vehicles approached the intersection near the local coffee shop, Reynolds finally made his move. He flipped on his patrol car's lights, the sudden burst of blue and red reflecting off the windows of nearby houses. The pickup truck's driver, showing no surprise or panic, calmly activated his turn signal and pulled over to the curb, positioning his vehicle perfectly parallel to the sidewalk. What happened next would change not just that evening, but the entire Cedar Grove Police Department. Neither Reynolds nor the pickup truck's driver knew it yet, but this simple traffic stop was about to become much more than just another example of questionable policing. It would become a story that people would talk about for years to come, a moment that would force an entire community to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the true meaning of justice. The red and blue lights painted shifting patterns on nearby buildings as Officer Reynolds took his time getting out of the patrol car. He adjusted his belt, straightened his badge, and made a show of taking each step deliberately toward the blue pickup. Through the rear window, he could see the driver sitting perfectly still, hands visible on the steering wheel, exactly as driver's education courses teach. Inside the truck, the driver took slow, measured breaths. As a Marine veteran who had survived 3 tours in Afghanistan, he learned that keeping calm was often the difference between life and death. But he hadn't expected to need those skills here, in a peaceful suburban neighborhood on a quiet Thursday evening. His military training had taught him to assess situations quickly, and something about this stop felt wrong from the start. License and registration, Reynolds demanded, his flashlight beam unnecessarily bright as he shined it directly into the driver's face, despite the well-lit street. The driver squinted but maintained his composure, reaching slowly and deliberately for his wallet. "Of course, officer," he replied respectfully, his voice steady and clear. "I'd like to know the reason for the stop, if you don't mind." His hands moved with practiced precision, making sure every movement was visible and non-threatening. Reynolds ignored the question, instead scrutinizing the license with exaggerated care. The driver's military bearing seemed to irritate him even more. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, despite having no legitimate reason for the command. By now, a small crowd of residents had gathered on their porches. An older couple who had lived in the neighborhood for decades watched with concerned expressions. They'd seen this officer in action before, but something felt different about tonight. "Sir," the driver responded calmly, "I don't mean any disrespect, but I haven't been told why I was stopped. Have I violated any traffic laws?" His voice remained steady, professional, the same tone he used countless times during high-pressure situations overseas. Reynolds' partner shifted uncomfortably behind him, aware that the stop was being observed by more and more neighbors. Some had their phones out, recording from a distance. The partner knew the stop didn't feel right, but remained silent, caught between duty to a fellow officer and what he knew was proper procedure. "I said step out of the vehicle," Reynolds repeated, his voice taking on an edge that made nearby observers nervous. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The driver, drawing on years of experience in tense situations, kept his response measured and professional. "Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but I've provided my documentation, and I'm not legally required to exit my vehicle without probable cause. Could you please explain why I was stopped?" More patrol cars began arriving, their lights creating a disco-like effect on the quiet suburban street. The growing police presence seemed excessive for a simple traffic stop, and neighbors watched with increasing concern. Some had started making phone calls, speaking in hushed but urgent tones about what they were witnessing. What should have been a routine interaction was quickly spiraling into something else entirely. The driver maintained his calm demeanor, but his mind was racing, evaluating options just as he'd done in combat situations. He knew his rights, but he also knew that sometimes being right wasn't enough to keep a situation from going wrong. The tension in the air was palpable as more officers approached the vehicle. Among them was a younger officer who would soon notice something that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. But for now, the driver sat perfectly still, hands visible, breathing steady, as Reynolds continued his unnecessary show of authority. Neighbors who had initially watched from their windows now stood in small groups on the sidewalk, their faces illuminated by the rotating emergency lights. They whispered among themselves, some recording videos, others making calls. The scene felt surreal, like something from the evening news that you never expect to see in your own neighborhood. The next few moments would prove crucial, not just for everyone present that night, but for the entire community. What started as an unwarranted traffic stop was about to become a pivotal moment that would expose long-standing issues within the local police department and lead to changes that nobody could have anticipated when those first patrol lights flashed on. The night air had grown colder as more patrol cars arrived at the scene, their idling engines humming in the otherwise quiet neighborhood. Steam rose from their exhaust pipes, mixing with the autumn mist that was starting to settle over Cedar Grove streets. The blue pickup truck was now surrounded by a semicircle of police vehicles, their emergency lights creating an unnecessary display of authority. Officer Reynolds had stepped back from the driver's window, speaking into his radio with exaggerated urgency about a suspicious subject and requesting additional backup. His tone suggested danger, but the reality was quite different. The driver remained perfectly calm, his hands still visible on the steering wheel, his expression composed despite the escalating situation. "Last time I'm asking nicely," Reynolds announced, returning to the driver's window. "Exit the vehicle now." His voice carried across the gathering crowd of concerned neighbors, some of whom had lived in Cedar Grove long enough to remember when police interactions were marked by respect and understanding rather than intimidation. The driver took a deep breath, his military training evident in his controlled response. "Officer, I mean no disrespect, but I know my rights. Without probable cause or reasonable suspicion, you can't legally order me out of my vehicle. I've provided all required documentation, and I've been nothing but cooperative. Could we please discuss why I was stopped in the first place?" A slight murmur ran through the crowd of onlookers. Several phones recorded the scene, their small screens capturing what was quickly becoming a textbook example of police overreach. An elderly gentleman who had served in Vietnam shook his head slowly, recognizing something in the driver's bearing that spoke of military service. Two more officers approached the vehicle, following Reynolds' lead but looking increasingly uncertain about the situation. The driver noticed their hesitation, a subtle shift in their body language that reminded him of how new recruits would sometimes question orders in the field when something didn't feel right. "We've got reports of suspicious activity in the area," Reynolds claimed, though no such reports existed. "We're going to search your vehicle." He gestured to his fellow officers to move in closer, creating an atmosphere of tension that was entirely unnecessary and increasingly uncomfortable for everyone present. The driver remained steady, his voice clear and professional. "Officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. I've done nothing wrong, and you have no warrant or probable cause. I respect your authority, but I also know my constitutional rights." A young mother watching from her porch pulled her children inside, but they continued to peek through the window, their small faces pressed against the glass. This wasn't the kind of community policing she had hoped her kids would grow up seeing. Reynolds' partner shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was unfolding. He'd been trained to de-escalate situations, not create them, and everything about this stop felt wrong. But department culture made it difficult to question a senior officer's decisions in the field. The tension reached a new level when Reynolds suddenly reached for the driver's door handle, testing it. The door was locked, and the driver remained still, though his jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign of his growing concern about the officer's increasingly aggressive behavior. More neighbors had gathered now, standing in small groups on both sides of the street. Their whispered conversations carried worried tones as they watched the scene unfold. Many had their phones out, not just recording, but sending messages to local community leaders and news outlets. This wasn't the first time they'd seen questionable police behavior in their neighborhood, but something about this stop felt different. The air grew thick with tension as Reynolds began circling the vehicle, shining his flashlight into every window, trying to manufacture a reason to escalate the situation further. The other officers maintained their positions, but their discomfort was becoming more visible with each passing moment. What happened next would take everyone by surprise. A simple accident that would completely change the dynamic of the situation. As the driver reached for his wallet again to show his ID to one of the other officers, something fell out. That small object, landing quietly on the pavement, would soon transform this tense standoff into something none of the officers had expected, especially Officer Reynolds. It was a small sound, barely noticeable amid the idling engines and murmuring crowd, just the soft tap of something plastic hitting the pavement. The driver's military ID card had slipped from his wallet, landing face up on the ground, its holographic surface catching the flickering red and blue lights from the patrol cars. One of the younger officers, who had been standing back from the scene with growing unease, noticed it first. As he bent down to retrieve the card, his flashlight beam caught the Marine Corps emblem. But it wasn't just the emblem that made him pause. It was the name and the recognition that followed. His hands actually trembled slightly as he read the details on the ID. The young officer had served too, though not in the Marines. He'd done 2 years in the Army before joining the police force, and every service member knew about what had happened in Kandahar province 3 years ago. The story had been in every military paper, had circulated through every base. A Marine unit caught in an ambush, surrounded by enemy forces, and the staff sergeant who had saved them all. "Sir," the young officer said, his voice carrying a new tone of respect that made everyone, including Officer Reynolds, turn to look. Are you the staff sergeant from the Kandahar incident?" The driver remained silent for a moment, his humility evident in his slight hesitation before answering. "I was just doing my job that day, officer, like every other Marine would have done." The atmosphere around the truck shifted instantly. Another officer, who had been reaching for his handcuffs, suddenly lowered his hands. He'd read about that incident too. How the sergeant had led his unit through a 6-hour firefight, carrying 2 wounded Marines to safety while coordinating an evacuation under heavy fire. The crowd of onlookers noticed a change in the officer's demeanor, though they didn't yet understand why. They watched as the young officer straightened his posture, almost instinctively coming to attention as he handed the ID back to the driver. "Sir, you received the Silver Star for that action," the young officer stated, loud enough for his fellow officers to hear. Around the scene, the word Silver Star rippled through the crowd like a wave, changing expressions from concern to confusion to dawning recognition. Officer Reynolds stood frozen, his flashlight beam wavering slightly. The driver he'd been harassing wasn't just any veteran. He was a decorated hero, someone who had risked his life repeatedly to save his fellow Marines. The body cameras caught Reynolds' expression changing as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. An older officer stepped forward, gently moving Reynolds aside. His face showed the realization that they had just spent the last 20 minutes harassing a man who had shown more courage and leadership in one day than most people demonstrate in a lifetime. The neighbors who had been recording the incident were now sharing whispered conversations about the Silver Star and what it meant. A retired military man in the crowd was explaining to others nearby. "It's one of the highest honors a service member can receive, awarded only for extraordinary gallantry in combat." The driver remained composed, his bearing unchanged despite the revelation. His humility in the face of recognition seemed to make the previous harassment even more shameful. He hadn't mentioned his service or his decorations, hadn't tried to use them to avoid the unfair treatment. He had simply stood his ground with the quiet dignity that had earned him his medals in the first place. Body cameras captured the entire scene as the dynamic shifted. The uncomfortable shuffling of officers who moments ago had been ready to forcibly remove a hero from his vehicle. The growing realization of their mistakes spreading across their faces, and the unchanged, professional demeanor of the Marine who had faced much worse situations with the same steady courage. What had started as an attempt to intimidate had transformed into a moment of reckoning. The next few minutes would see not just a complete change in how the officers handled the situation, but the beginning of a larger conversation about power, respect, and the true meaning of service to one's community. The next few minutes unfolded like a scene from a movie, but this was real life playing out on a quiet suburban street. Word of the driver's identity spread through the gathered officers like wildfire. Their body cameras captured every moment as the realization dawned on their faces. They hadn't just stopped any Marine veteran, they had stopped a genuine hero. The young officer who had first recognized the Silver Star recipient couldn't contain his mix of awe and embarrassment. "I read about what you did, sir," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the night air. "That day in Kandahar, you saved your entire unit." He turned to his fellow officers, feeling compelled to share the story. When their convoy was ambushed, he stayed behind to cover the evacuation. carried 2 wounded Marines to safety under heavy fire. The crowd of neighbors listened intently, their phones still recording, but now capturing a very different story than the one they'd expected to share. An elderly veteran in the crowd removed his cap in respect, and others around him followed suit as they learned more about the man in the pickup truck. Officer Reynolds stood back now, his earlier aggression replaced by visible discomfort. His body camera recorded his nervous adjustments of his uniform, the way he couldn't quite meet anyone's eyes. The same ID he had dismissed earlier now felt like a weight in the air, pressing down on his conscience. The driver maintained his dignified composure, neither boasting about his achievements nor showing anger about his treatment. When he finally spoke, his voice remained as calm and professional as it had been from the start. "I appreciate the recognition," he said quietly, "but I'm just one of many who served. What I'd really appreciate is if we could discuss why I was stopped in the first place." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Several of the other officers exchanged glances, their discomfort obvious. They knew there had been no valid reason for the stop, no real suspicion of any crime. The pretense of suspicious activity in the area now felt paper-thin and embarrassingly transparent. One of the senior officers present stepped forward, taking control of the situation. His face showed the strain of someone who knew a serious mistake had been made. "Sir, on behalf of the department, I want to apologize for this incident." He glanced at Officer Reynolds, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. This stop should never have happened. Neighbors who had been watching began to share their own stories in hushed voices. Other unnecessary stops, other incidents of harassment they'd witnessed or experienced. The presence of a decorated Marine had cracked open a door that had been kept carefully shut, revealing a pattern that could no longer be ignored. The body cameras continued recording as more details about the driver's service record emerged. Each new detail made the unnecessary stop seem more egregious. He hadn't just earned the Silver Star. He'd also received multiple commendations for his leadership and judgment under pressure, the very qualities that had kept this situation from escalating despite the provocations he'd faced. Some of the younger officers began distancing themselves from Reynolds, both physically and symbolically. They'd followed his lead at first, but now they were seeing the consequences of blind obedience to authority. The driver's military bearing and calm demeanor provided a stark contrast to Reynolds' increasingly agitated state. As news of the incident spread through official channels, senior police officials were already being notified. The body camera footage would soon make its way to the chief's office, along with a growing number of videos recorded by residents. What had started as one officer's abuse of power was about to become a catalyst for change in the entire department. The night air had grown colder, but nobody moved to leave. They all sensed they were witnessing something important, a moment when truth and justice aligned to shine a light on systemic problems that could no longer be ignored. The decorated Marine's presence had done more than just expose one officer's misconduct. It had created an opportunity for real change in how the department operated. The morning after the incident, the police chief sat in his office, his coffee growing cold, as he reviewed the body camera footage for the third time. The screens in front of him showed multiple angles of the previous night's events, each one making it increasingly clear that his department had a serious problem to address. Down the hall, internal affairs investigators were already conducting interviews. Officers who had been present at the scene spoke in hushed tones about what they'd witnessed. The young officer who had recognized the Marine's ID shared his perspective with a steady voice, though his hands gripped his coffee cup tightly as he described how the situation had nearly spiraled out of control. He handled it with more patience than most people would have, the young officer explained to the investigators. Here's a man who led his unit through one of the worst ambushes in recent history, and he's being harassed in his own hometown. The officer's voice carried a mix of admiration for the Marine and shame for his department's actions. By midday, local news vans had gathered outside the police station. The story had spread quickly through the community, with cell phone videos from neighbors already circulating on social media. Each clip showed a different angle of the same troubling scene. A decorated Marine veteran being harassed without cause. Inside the station, Officer Reynolds sat alone in a conference room, his usual confidence replaced by nervous fidgeting as he waited to meet with his superiors. The Internal Affairs investigation had uncovered a pattern in his traffic stops, a disturbing history of similar incidents that had gone unchallenged until now. Community leaders began calling for a broader investigation. The elderly veteran who had witnessed the scene organized a meeting at the local community center, where residents shared their own experiences with law enforcement. The room was packed, with people standing along the walls, all eager to finally have their voices heard. The Marine's calm dignity during the incident had struck a chord with everyone who witnessed it. He had every right to be angry, one neighbor told the gathering. But instead, he showed us what real leadership looks like. The crowd nodded in agreement, many sharing their own recordings of how the veteran had maintained his composure despite the unfair treatment. Back at the station, the police chief made a difficult but necessary decision. He called a department-wide meeting, where he played the body camera footage for all to see. The room fell silent as they watched their fellow officers' behavior, the unnecessary escalation, and the moment of revelation of the driver's identity. "This stops now," the chief announced to his assembled officers. "What happened last night wasn't just an embarrassment to our department. It was a violation of everything we're supposed to stand for." His words carried the weight of someone who knew major changes were needed. The investigation moved quickly. Records showed that Officer Reynolds had a history of complaints that had been overlooked or dismissed. Other officers began coming forward, sharing their concerns about similar incidents they'd witnessed but hadn't reported. The blue wall of silence was beginning to crack. Local television stations interviewed residents who had witnessed the incident. An elderly couple who had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years spoke about how policing had changed, becoming more aggressive and less community-oriented. Their words resonated with viewers across the city. By week's end, the story had attracted national attention. Civil rights organizations reached out to the Marine, offering support for legal action. But those who had seen him that night weren't surprised when they learned his response. He wasn't interested in punitive measures. He had a different idea about how to turn this incident into something positive for the community. The chief of police had to face the cameras himself, acknowledging that changes were needed. The incident had exposed not just one officer's misconduct, but a deeper problem in how the department operated. As he prepared to announce a series of reforms, he couldn't help but reflect on the irony. It had taken a Marine's patience and dignity to show them what real public service looked like. 3 months after that fateful traffic stop, the community center's main hall was filled to capacity. People from all walks of life sat together, their attention focused on the front of the room where the Marine veteran stood at the podium. He wasn't there to condemn or criticize. He was there to help launch a new chapter in community policing. "What happened that night could have ended differently," he began, his voice steady and clear. "But instead of letting it divide us, we're going to use it to bring positive change." The crowd included both civilians and police officers, some of whom had been present that night. Even a few who had initially supported Officer Reynolds were there, their perspectives transformed by recent events. The changes had started small, but grew quickly. Officer Reynolds had resigned 2 weeks after the incident, faced with overwhelming evidence of his pattern of misconduct. But rather than stopping there, the Marine had proposed something unexpected. A comprehensive training program that would bring military veterans and police officers together to share experiences and learn from each other. In the Marines, we learned that leadership isn't about power. It's about responsibility, he explained to the gathered crowd. Every time we put on our uniform, we carried the responsibility to protect and serve. His words resonated with both the officers and community members present, bridging a gap that had seemed uncrossable just months before. The police chief stood up next, looking more relaxed than he had in months. "Thanks to our friend here," he gestured to the Marine, "we've completely revamped our training programs. He explained how every officer would now go through enhanced community engagement training with special emphasis on de-escalation techniques and cultural awareness. In the audience, the young officer who had first recognized a Marine's ID sat with his new partner. He had been promoted to field training officer, specifically chosen to help implement the new programs. His experience that night had transformed him from a passive observer into an active agent of change within the department. The changes weren't just on paper. Real differences could be seen on the streets. Officers were spending more time walking their beats, getting to know the residents. Community meetings weren't just about reporting crimes anymore. They became forums for real dialogue between police and citizens. The elderly veteran who had witnessed the original incident stood up to share his perspective. "I've lived here for 40 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For the first time in a long while, I feel like we're getting back to what policing should be, serving and protecting the community." Body camera footage from that night had become a teaching tool in the police academy. New recruits watched it not just as an example of what not to do, but as a lesson in how one person's dignity and composure could transform a potentially dangerous situation into an opportunity for positive change. The Marines' influence extended beyond just the local department. Other cities began reaching out, wanting to learn about the training program he had helped develop. What had started as one incident of injustice was blossoming into a movement for positive change in police departments across the state. A year after the incident, the community gathered again, this time for a celebration. Crime rates had dropped, complaints against officers were down significantly, and most importantly, trust was being rebuilt. Children who had once been taught to fear the police were now waving to officers they knew by name. The Marine stood at the back of this gathering, watching with quiet satisfaction. He hadn't wanted money or revenge. He had wanted change, and he had helped achieve it. His silver star was impressive, but perhaps his greatest service to his country had been turning a moment of potential conflict into an opportunity for lasting improvement. As the evening wound down, he spoke with a group of new police recruits. "Remember," he told them, "true strength isn't about having power over others. It's about having the wisdom to use your authority to protect and serve." The recruits listened intently, understanding that they were part of something important, a new approach to policing that put community service first.